It's just after 1 in the morning in southwestern Minnesota, and the temperature has dropped into the high 30s. Out here, there are no streetlights. There's no glow from a nearby town leaking into the sky. Just flat, black farmland stretching in every direction, broken only by the thin ribbon of a gravel road. A phone rings in a house 7 miles away. A father picks it up. On the other end is his son's voice, a little shaken, a little embarrassed but calm. "I went in the ditch," he says. "I'm okay, I just need a ride." That call would last 47 minutes, and by the time it ended, Brandon Swanson would be gone. Not hurt, not found unconscious, not located the next morning wandering a field, cold but alive. Gone completely for over 16 years. No body, no blood, no torn clothing, not even his phone or his keys or a single shoe. Just a car sitting empty in a ditch, and a scent trail that a team of bloodhounds followed for 3 miles before it simply stopped at the edge of a river that has been searched, drained, and excavated more times than anyone can count, and has never given up a single answer. This is the story of the last night anyone heard from Brandon Swanson. And it's the story of a mistake so small, a single wrong guess about which direction was home, that it may have cost him his life. But that's not even the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part is what happened after he hung up. Or rather, what didn't happen. Because for 2 full days after Brandon Swanson vanished into the dark, his cell phone kept ringing. Before we get to that night, you have to understand who Brandon Swanson actually was. Because this wasn't a troubled kid who might have wanted to disappear. This was, by every account from the people who knew him, the opposite of that. Brandon was 19. He stood about 5'6", wore wire-framed glasses, and had a habit of tilting his baseball cap slightly to the side. He was legally blind in one eye, a detail that becomes important later when you think about a young man trying to navigate open farmland in pitch darkness. He'd graduated high school in Marshall, Minnesota, the year before, and instead of rushing off to a 4-year university, he'd chosen something more practical, a 1-year certificate program in wind turbine technology at a community college 20 minutes away in the small town of Canby. People who knew Brandon describe him almost unanimously as responsible, grounded, the kind of teenager who called his parents instead of avoiding them. He worked for years at a local grocery store. He loved to read. He had plans, real, specific plans, to transfer that fall to a college over 250 miles away to eventually build a career in the sciences. This matters because when someone vanishes, the first question investigators ask is always the same. Did they want to disappear? Was there a reason to run? And with Brandon, nearly every answer pointed away from that theory. No history of depression, no signs of instability, no indication in the days or weeks before that anything was wrong. Which makes what happened on the night of May 13th, 2008, even harder to explain. That evening marked the last day of the spring semester at Brandon's college. A group of friends gathered at a house in the small town of Canby to celebrate. It was a low-key night, some drinks, some conversation, nothing that anyone present would later describe as wild or out of control. Brandon had a few beers, not by most accounts, enough to be seriously impaired. His father would later insist that his son didn't sound drunk on the phone that night, just a little embarrassed about the ditch. Around midnight, Brandon said his goodbyes and got into his green Chevrolet Lumina to make the roughly 30-minute drive home to Marshall. For reasons that have never been fully explained, he didn't take the main highway. He chose the back roads instead, a maze of unmarked gravel routes that cut through the farmland, the kind of roads only someone who'd grown up in the area would think to use as a shortcut. It was somewhere on one of those roads, in the deep, moonless dark of rural Minnesota, that Brandon lost control of his car and drove into a ditch. He wasn't hurt. The car wasn't badly damaged. It was just stuck, wedged at an angle he couldn't drive out of alone. He tried calling a couple of friends first. Nobody answered. So a little after 1 in the morning, he called his parents. What happened over the next 47 minutes is, piece by piece, the entire mystery. Brandon told his father, Brian, that he believed he was near a small town called Lind, a place just a few miles from home, one his family knew well. Brian and his wife, Annette, got in their truck immediately and drove out toward that area, keeping Brandon on the phone the entire time, trying to use his description of the landscape to pinpoint him. But no matter where they drove, they couldn't find him. They flashed their headlights into the darkness. They called out his name from the truck. Brandon, on his end, said he couldn't see them either. At some point during the call, Brandon made a decision that would define the rest of the night. Instead of staying with the car, instead of waiting for his parents to eventually find him, he got out and started walking. He climbed over fences. He crossed open fields. He told his father he could hear water nearby and that he was heading toward a light he could see in the distance, one he believed was coming from the town he thought he was near. Investigators would later determine something Brandon apparently didn't know in the moment. He was wrong about where he was, not by a little. Cell tower data placed him nowhere near Lind. He was closer to 25 miles away, near a different small town entirely. On the opposite side of the search area his parents were desperately combing through. Whether Brandon ever realized this discrepancy himself, no one knows. He never said so on the phone. He just kept walking, kept talking to his father, kept describing a landscape that didn't match anywhere his parents could see. And then, 47 minutes into the call, everything changed in less than a second. Brandon Swanson would later describe the moment with painful precision, because he has had over 16 years to replay it in his mind. His son, mid-sentence, suddenly let out a sharp, startled exclamation. 2 words. A reaction to something, we don't know what, directly in front of him. And then the line went dead. Not a slow fade, not the crackle of a dying battery. It cut off abruptly as if the call had simply been dropped. Brian tried calling back immediately. It rang, no answer. He tried again and again, nothing. For the rest of that night, Brandon's parents drove the back roads alone, calling his name into the dark, waiting for a call that never came. When morning arrived and there was still no word from their son, the Swansons did what any parent would do. They called the police. And this is where the case takes its first genuinely infuriating turn, because for the first several hours, officers weren't particularly concerned. Brandon was 19, legally an adult, and in 2008, that classification came with a quiet, unspoken bias in how missing person cases were handled. Officers reportedly suggested that this kind of thing, a young guy staying out, not checking in, wasn't unusual, that he'd probably turn up. The Swansons knew that wasn't who their son was. They pushed, and eventually, as the day went on and there was still no sign of him, the investigation began in earnest. Here's where the case became far more complicated than anyone initially expected. Using cell tower data, investigators traced Brandon's phone activity to an area nowhere near where his parents had been searching all night. His actual location, the place he'd walked from, was closer to a town called Taunton, roughly 25 miles from where he'd told his father he believed he was. 25 miles, in the dark. On foot, cutting through fields he didn't know, near a river he may not have realized was there until he was standing at its edge. His car, the green Lumina, was eventually found abandoned in a ditch near the Lincoln County line, undamaged enough that it clearly hadn't been in a serious crash, and with no sign that Brandon himself had ever made it back to it. What came next is the part of this case that has haunted investigators, search volunteers, and true crime researchers for over a decade and a half. Search dogs, specialized bloodhounds brought in from a neighboring state, picked up Brandon's scent near the abandoned car. The trail led them roughly 3 miles across open farmland, past fences he'd apparently climbed, through the ruins of an abandoned farm, and eventually toward a fast-moving body of water called the Yellow Medicine River. At the water's edge, the dog's handlers watched as one of the bloodhounds jumped directly into the river. Behavior the handler would later interpret as a possible sign that Brandon himself had gone into the water at that exact spot. For years, that became the leading theory, that Brandon, walking in complete darkness, exhausted, disoriented, and unaware of how close he was to a steep riverbank, simply didn't see it coming, that he fell, or stumbled, into fast-moving water that at the time was running high and cold from spring runoff in some places over 10 feet deep. It's a clean, tragic explanation, and it would probably be the accepted answer to this case if the story ended there. But it doesn't, because the scent trail didn't actually stop at the river. According to the search team's own records, after that dog entered, and exited the water, the trail continued. It picked back up on the opposite bank, followed the river line further north, and eventually ended at a gravel road forming the county line, nowhere near where anyone expected it to lead. If Brandon drowned in that river that night, there's a detail that doesn't fit. His cell phone did not go dead the moment the call dropped. According to phone records, it continued receiving calls, ringing several times before going to voicemail, for 2 full days afterward. A phone submerged in water typically fails almost immediately, going straight to voicemail with no rings at all. A phone that rings normally for 2 days is, by every account, still functioning somewhere dry, which means that somewhere for 2 days Brandon Swanson's phone sat intact, unsubmerged, untouched, and no one has ever found it. In the months and years that followed, search efforts around Brandon's disappearance became some of the largest in Minnesota's history. Volunteers, professional search and rescue teams, cadaver dogs, helicopters, and boats combed a search area eventually mapped out at roughly 140 square miles of farmland, described by search coordinators as some of the most difficult terrain to search in the country. Searches happened every spring after the snow melted and before planting season made the fields inaccessible. They happened every fall after harvest cleared the crops that had hidden the ground for months. This cycle repeated year after year for over a decade. In the fall of 2021, a drought caused the Yellow Medicine River to dry up almost completely, offering investigators an opportunity they'd never had before. Excavation crews moved in and physically dug through the exposed riverbed, searching for any trace of Brandon's remains or belongings. They found nothing. To this day, not one piece of physical evidence connected to Brandon Swanson has ever been recovered. Not his phone, not his car keys, not a scrap of clothing. In a case with this much searching, this many resources, and this much time, that absence of evidence is, in its own way, one of the most unsettling details of all. So what actually happened to Brandon Swanson? Investigators, researchers, and true crime communities have spent 16 years chasing down every possible explanation. None of them fit cleanly. The drowning theory remains the most widely cited, mostly because the physical geography lines up. A disoriented young man, walking in total darkness near a fast, high river with a steep bank that's difficult to see coming even in daylight. But the 2-day active cell phone and the scent trail that continued past the water are details that theory has never been able to explain away. There's the theory that Brandon suffered some kind of medical event, a fall, a seizure, an injury from the terrain itself, something that could explain the sudden, startled exclamation in his final words. But no trace of him was ever found in the surrounding fields, despite exhaustive searches specifically targeting that possibility. There's the theory, raised early on and never fully eliminated, of foul play. That someone else was out on those roads that night. That Brandon's abrupt, panicked reaction wasn't the sound of him tripping in the dark, but the sound of him encountering another person. Investigators have stated, publicly and repeatedly, that they've never identified a suspect or found direct evidence supporting this. But they've also never been willing to rule it out entirely. And then there's the theory almost no one who actually knew Brandon believes, that he disappeared on purpose. That somewhere in those 47 minutes, a 19-year-old with no history of running, no motive to vanish, and no resources to survive off-grid, simply decided to walk into a new life and never look back. His family has always rejected this outright, and it's hard to argue with them. It's difficult to imagine someone staying on the phone with their father for nearly an hour, guiding him through a fake emergency, purely to stage their own disappearance. And even if that were the plan, the question remains unanswered. Gone where? Picked up by whom? Hidden by whom? Every theory explains a piece of this case. None of them explain all of it. Brandon Swanson's disappearance did not just leave a family with an empty chair at every holiday for over 16 years. It changed the law. In the aftermath of the initial search, the Swansons discovered a devastating flaw in how Minnesota handled missing adult cases. The same flaw that delayed the search for their son by crucial hours on that first morning. Police weren't required to treat a missing adult report with urgency. Investigating agencies weren't required to coordinate quickly across county lines. There was no clear requirement to assess whether a missing person might be in danger before deciding whether to act. Brandon and Annette Swanson spent the following year lobbying the Minnesota State Legislature directly. In 2009, their efforts resulted in the passage of what's now known as Brandon's Law, legislation requiring police to immediately begin investigating missing adult reports rather than assuming, by default, that an adult who hasn't checked in has simply chosen to disappear on their own. It's a law that has, by most accounts, saved lives in the years since. A small, permanent consequence of one family's worst night, built specifically so that no other family would have to wait as long as they did for someone to start looking. To this day, the porch light at the Swanson family home stays on every night. It has, for over 16 years, a quiet signal, kept burning long after most people would have given up hope in case Brandon ever finds his way back to it. Tips still come in. The Lyon County Sheriff's Office has said, publicly, that they've never stopped receiving them, and that the case remains active. Every so often, a new search resumes when the fields clear after harvest, walked by volunteers who've been doing this for over a decade, looking for something, anything, that might finally answer the question that's outlived an entire law, an entire community's collective memory, and, at this point, most of Brandon's own childhood. What actually happened in that field, on that riverbank, in the seconds after he shouted into the phone and the line went dead? Nobody knows. Not his family, not the investigators who've spent 16 years on this case, not the search teams who've walked that same 3 miles more times than anyone can count. All that's left is a green car in a ditch that's long since been towed away, a scent trail that led to a river and then somehow kept going, and a porch light in Marshall, Minnesota, that has never once gone dark. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Brandon Swanson, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension is still actively taking tips. Somewhere out there, someone might know what happened during those final seconds. And until they come forward, Brandon Swanson remains exactly where he's been since May 14, 2008. Missing, without a trace.